and it's a powerhouse panel, I must say. So it includes a panel on the systemic issues and human rights considerations for informal kinship carers. And the panel members include Garth Morgan, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Protection Committee, Scott McDougall, who's the Queensland Human Rights Commissioner, and Commissioner Natalie Lewis from the Queensland Family and Child Commission. So I'll start the questions, and again, if you have questions for the panel, please enter them into the chat line. But I'll start with you, Garth, and what Rachel has outlined is a massive problem that exists, and in Queensland, there's around up to 20,000 children living in informal kinship care, and Rachel outlined a number of the issues that are not only financial, but other impacts that these arrangements have both on the well-being of those carers, but also the children in their care. Is there a special significance to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and communities when we start to look at these issues of extended of kinship care?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think I've got to say I feel a bit outnumbered because I'm looking down at Nat and Scott side by side. I've got the two commissioners within the frame of a human rights forum. So I'm going to come at it from, some of the stuff that we're doing at QATSIP, and, that absolutely aligns with the human rights frame. But I'd say, yeah, absolutely, there is a specific and special significance, Lindsay. There are a whole lot of, historical reasons that Aboriginal people are being left behind in Australia's economic participation. The median weekly income for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is only about 60% of that as non-Indigenous Australians. In a recent report by the AIHW noted, as of 2018-19, that more than half of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people reported that they couldn't raise $2,000 within a week for an emergency that arose in the family. But more alarmingly, though, for me, that represents a 5.4% increase over 4 years. And so the gap is widening. And, it's a stark reminder of the work that we have ahead of us to try to halt that. If you combine the, I suppose the economic disadvantage faced by a number of our mob with the fact that we have bigger families, it kind of underscores for me why it's so important that we're doing what we're trying to do with our Family Caring for Families program. But it's also why I'm so optimistic about the future for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids. See, I see the program as a viable alternative to the traditional foster care, kinship care. And I see it as a program that supports Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families in a range of contextual settings. So, specifically for me, that's, outside of the statutory system. And my greatest hope is actually that we are able to reduce the need for statutory intervention through the Family Caring for Families model. And so the program will support families in a number of ways, but it may also include financial support. And so what we're really trying to do, amongst other things, is eliminate poverty as a reason for the family not being able to step up the way that we want to be able to step up. And we don't want to continue this situation where poverty is one of the reasons why our kids slip into the out-of-home care system. And I talk about, and I think about upper middle class families, and they've often got the ability to absorb the kinds of financial shocks that might come along, with caring for a grandchild or nephew or niece. And all of that happens outside of the statutory system. And, as you mentioned before, Lindsay, the rate of informal care is a significant proportion of kids in care. And we want to ensure that informal care is supported financially, so that we don't have carers that, are sort of bearing the brunt of a system that's kind of turned a blind eye. And, we absolutely want to keep our kids out of statutory care if at all possible. So, the program that we, Candice spoke about at the last forum, there'll be aspects that look, fairly similar to a kinship care program, but, there'll be some key differences. on the surface, the structures might be similar, but you have Aboriginal people finding the right family members to look after kids, be able to keep kids connected to their mob because they're already with their mob. And we'll be able to hopefully work with that same group of kids and families that might be families that you'd find in foster care, kinship care. But by eliminating poverty as the reason for them slipping into that next step, we might actually be able to remove a whole heap of those kids, remove the need for the statutory system to intervene here. And that'll also help, free up resources for where we do need to provide extra support for those kids that are in the statutory system. Because it'll be cheaper, it'll be a better outcome, more sustainable. Kids will be connected to their culture and their mob if they're staying with family, and we're resourcing family to do what we know our families want to do. So I think, Lindsay, this is an incredibly important forum. I'm glad to be asked to be talking at this one because it's so critical that we address this issue for our kids and families.
Garth, one of the things you mentioned was the presentation that Candace, the wonderful Candace Butler from QuadSip, delivered at the previous Kinship Care Forum we ran, and the video of that session has been released by us now. So yep. I certainly encourage people who are online at the moment, if they haven't watched that presentation by Candace about the QuadSip model, to do so. But I mean, certainly what Candace talked about and the model was really breaking down those distinctions that exist between formal and informal kinship care, and really taking on board a model that's much more relevant to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child rearing practices, I guess, but a more normal thing. And it did strike me the other day, and I hadn't actually thought about this, but in my own family as a child, my parents for a significant period of time cared for my niece, and it just dawned on me, they were informal kinship carers. But I hadn't thought about that or used the terms. They were just, she was my niece and she was living with us for a few months. And, but certainly you were right that it wasn't a massive financial impact for my family, but for other families, it can be a massive financial impact.
Yeah. And I think, our program hopes to break that down. In some ways it might be that, we find that the right auntie, the right uncle, the grandma, the person that has cultural authority for that child, and that family believes is the right person to be looking after that child and supporting them financially to do that. That's absolutely an aspect of it. But another aspect might be that family have come together and have decided that, with support from family, kids are able to stay here in home with mum and dad, but maybe auntie needs to take every Monday off to make sure the mum gets a good start to the week, and we can backfill her salary, right? So we're not impacting on that. I imagine there'd be a number of families where they would just go, look, I need to take Mondays off for the next 3 months, and it's not going to kill them financially. We've got a family where auntie's got 6 kids of her own, and then having to take extra time off work. That might be something that we can do as part of this program, as well as thinking about it as a more, I suppose, more culturally grounded way of doing kinship care. There are a whole range of other things that I'm really keen to explore through the program. One of the, I suppose, most exciting things for me is that we're going to be trialling it in a couple of locations, and I'm really keen to see what comes from the ground up, because this is really part of a broader, reform piece that we're doing about taking ownership and control over the design, delivery, development, and eventually funding of our own programs. Wrapping our program development and the outcomes within an evidence base, within an evidence and research base, so we are collecting our own evidence and we can demonstrate what works for our kids and families. So we might see a whole range of really innovative things that come up from those 2 sites. One's in Toowoomba and one's in Brisbane. And so we'll get a couple of different, contexts. We've got a rural sort of context and a really urban one. But I think, one of the things that I'm really keen to do is to look for every opportunity to turn the system on its head, get kids out of the system and support families to kind of do the things that we want to do and that we've always wanted to do. So, yeah, it's a really important insight.
Excellent, thanks. And we'll look forward to the trials. I'll turn now to Commissioner Scott McDougall. Scott, over 200,000 Queensland children living under the poverty line, around up to 20,000 children living in informal kinship care arrangements with relatives who are not their parents. Is there a human rights lens that we should be attaching to this? Are there issues around human rights that we should be concerned about, both for the carers of these children, but also these children themselves?
Yeah, absolutely, Lindsay, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today. I guess, there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and of course, many people would know that here in Queensland now we have a Human Rights Act that was introduced last year. And I thought that rather than talk to it, I would just read out a couple of the sections because they speak of themselves and they speak quite powerfully. Section 26, protection of families and children. Families are the fundamental group unit of society and are entitled to be protected by society and the state. So just going back to Rachel's comments, I caught the end of the Senator's comments. I would certainly support the push to have this addressed nationally. Obviously, the Human Rights Act in Queensland can't bind the Commonwealth, but I really think advocates everywhere should be using the language of Queensland's Human Rights Act, specifically referring to that entitlement of families to be protected by society and the state. So that means adequately financially supported, and also other things as well. Another provision in that section says every child has the right without discrimination to the protection that is needed by the child and is in the child's best interest because of being a child. And that recognises the special status of children in international human rights law. So children's well-being needs to be front and centre of the national agenda. So, and I think that's supported by that provision. In Queensland's Human Rights Act, we also have a number of other rights that are really highly relevant to the situation. The first one is the cultural rights of Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And this provision is one that I'm sure will be tested in due course in front of the courts. But again, it's really important that more people have an awareness, understanding that this right is now protected in Queensland, and that Aboriginal communities and families and individuals are resourced to assert this right. And in fact, I can give one example of how it has been utilised in a different context, and that was by Adrian Biragubba in a complaint he made against police in relation to his occupation of the Adani mine site. So that complaint resulted in an agreement with the police where they actually apologised to Adrian and allowed him to continue his occupation of the site. And it was the cultural rights that he relied on to achieve that outcome. So I just want to get that message out that the Act is here and it is able to be used. But the cultural rights include a provision which says to enjoy, maintain, control, protect, and develop their kinship ties. So we know that for millennia, Aboriginal grandparents have been looking after children closely. It's a strong cultural right, and it needs to be supported by the state. There are some other rights that are relevant as well. The right to privacy is also relevant because it protects a person's privacy and home and family, and so that all those things can't be arbitrarily interfered with. And there are also economic, social and cultural rights that are protected in the Act. And I think most notably the right to access education and also to access health services without discrimination. I just caught the end of Rachel's talk, but I gather that education issues have arisen as part of the discussion. The other issue that sort of looms large, I think, in Queensland is the issue around blue cards and the impact that it has, particularly on kinship care arrangements. And I'd be curious to find out more about how it might impact on informal carers as well, and whether there's reticence to engage with support services for fear of encountering blue card issues. I do know that Robbie Katter has a private members bill before the Parliament at the moment on blue cards. There's some people at my commission who are looking at it, so we'll be looking at that bill. It's quite a complex legal issue, as well as obviously social and political and cultural issue. But clearly something needs to be done on blue cards, because everywhere I go and talk to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout Queensland, blue cards comes up as an issue time and time again. So clearly the system isn't working for the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community, and I suspect that it probably is having impacts in this area as well. So I hope that answers your question, Lindsay, and thank you once again for the opportunity.
Oh, you're welcome. And as people know, these sessions are being recorded, so all those references to the Human Rights Act that's got made, I think will be valuable for people to look up, but we'll make sure that we also send copies of those relevant sections to you as well. And I must say about the Katter bill, that we're certainly having a keen interest in looking very closely at that bill, and certainly member organisations of PeakCare have been invited to talk to us further about the elements of that bill, because we think the bill does bring to the fore a number of issues that need closer examination. So thank you for mentioning that as well. I'll turn now to Natalie Lewis, Commissioner from the Queensland Family and Child Commission. And Natalie, you've already heard a lot of information presented, but what are the issues of concern that the Queensland Family and Child Commission has around these issues? What are you concerned about?
I think, can I just start just by, I just want to say that the work that QAPSIP is progressing in this space, you know, and while there's those orientations around recognition of, you know, the significance culturally of kinship through our kinship structures, that as a reform piece and as an opportunity has a striking validity across the entire population of kinship, informal kinship care particularly. I think it's just another example of, you know, that innovation and that thought leadership coming from the community controlled sector to provide a solution which can, you know, extend benefits to many children across Queensland. So I also just wanted to say that I guess our biggest concern really does focus around the visibility of this cohort of children and young people and their carers. So when we were, Rachel was talking about the issues around inclusion in the census, for example, a really dedicated focus in a Queensland context in understanding the, you know, the scale and the scope of this issue for us in Queensland. I think, you know, while there's been some great research that's been done in that space, I think it warrants further support of a research agenda to truly understand the, you know, the scale of the issue, so that we can start to think about how we attack this and how we address it. I think that issue around visibility of children means that their support needs aren't visible and aren't receiving the focus and the advocacy, you know, that is warranted. When we think about things like financial support and other structured support, you know, being contingent on statutory intervention, I don't think that that's the road that we want to go down. We want to be able to figure out a way that families can legitimately access the supports that they need to care for and to grow children that have equitable access, you know, and full enjoyment of all of their rights, without that necessitating the surveillance of the statutory system. One of the, you know, the issues I think in, you know, in the literature, and that is obviously not, not unknown to I'm sure many people on this is the issue around stability and permanency, and that the disruption that can be caused as the conflict plays out, within families. And I think that, we all know that the fragility of those types of arrangements, can have real consequences for children in terms of that feeling of safety and knowing where you're going to be and being able to feel comfortable to maintain or to, the types of relationships that are important to children. And I think that not having the supports available for families to navigate their way through that conflict, to be able to preserve and prioritise those relationships, I think that that's incredibly sad, because the consequence is is felt by children who people are acting to try to protect. So I think generally, I think that there's a lack of recognition and action nationally and in all jurisdictions in relation to child poverty. So I think that it's interesting to watch the flick pass and the shift in language about, well, it's not convenient right now to talk about poverty generally. What if we focus on child poverty? And I think that the narrative around that really moves us away from centering the real impacts of poverty, the scale of the experience of poverty of children, whether those are children in in informal kinship care or otherwise. And I think that that is a central issue, not just in relation to kinship care, but for our country generally, has been ignored for far too long. So starting with that big issue, I think is incredibly important.
Yes, thanks, Natalie. We're just looking at people who've got questions for any of the panel members, if you'd like to start sending those through now. One of the issues that you raised, Natalie, that I think is incredibly important, is that when the services that are needed to support children, with whomever they are being cared for, is contingent upon them having contact with the child protection system or entering care. There's something terribly wrong with that. So is there a solution to this that you see, that we don't have to ensure that in order for children to receive the services they need, or their families, that it is not contingent upon them entering the statutory child protection system?
I think that, Lindsay, sometimes I probably have a tendency to oversimplify things, but I think the importance of understanding the scale so that we can really recognise what the demand is, and then, simple changes around the eligibility criteria to access supports that exist, that are currently, that we think about as being accessible for families in contact with the child protection system, can potentially serve a much broader purpose in providing support to families or children experiencing vulnerability. A simple shift around that eligibility criteria to access supports, and for people to be able to do so, knowing that that's not going to result in an extra phone call to child safety or raise, the visibility of their vulnerability, to the department. If we understand what that demand looks like and then invest commensurate to that, to that level of demand, I think that would be a really good starting point.
Yeah, it's certainly, as I mentioned in the beginning, it was quite purposeful that we held this event during Anti-Poverty Week, because we see the relationships between the two as incredibly important to explore. And we did get quite a lot of good media coverage on the weekend when Anti-Poverty Week was launched at West End. And I think some of the reporters we spoke to were very surprised about the data that we had to show them. But 1 in 5 children now living below the poverty line is extraordinary. That's well over 200,000 children living under the poverty line in Queensland alone. And many of those would be through entering into informal kinship care arrangements. So it's grandparents having to postpone retirement, cash in their super and lifestyle adjustments, young adult carers caring for siblings and nephews and nieces who are postponing their careers and their study and so on, and also enduring incredible financial hardship. Of course, it's not, financial impact is not the only impact. There's Rachel mentioned also there's children are living in these arrangements with some kind of reason for why they're living in these arrangements. And often that's been traumatic for them. So there's those kind of supports that are necessary as well. But certainly if you've got no financial pressure, it's much easier to deal with those issues. Just seeing if there's any other questions that have come through. No? All right. Well, we have a couple of minutes. Are there any final points? Oh, we've just got one through. Yes, Tom?
Yep. I'll put this question to the group and just have a think about who might be best placed to respond. And thank you, Joshua, for the question. So with stats showing that the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children entering the care system exceed the number of children exiting that care system, much focus has been put into that preventative work that kind of will help divert children away.
Sorry, what's the question? What, sorry, can you just?
I think, sorry, Garth, just to recap on the question, it's around kind of looking at seeing an increasing number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children coming into the care system. How much additional focus either has been or needs to continue to be placed in diverting kids away from that system?
Well, can I answer that in the spirit of, Poverty Week? And that's that with kids that are in the system to the rate of 43-ish%, a miserly 3% of the entire budget is provided to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organisations. And so if we're absolutely serious about stopping kids coming into care, then we need to ensure that our organisations that are connected to working with families in community, are funded at the same rate. And so I think we can always do more in the preventative space. But one of the things that I'm also really concerned about is once our kids are in the system, they just get lost to the system. They go deeper into the system, they stay longer in the system. The amount of kids that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids that are removed in their first year of life is just gut-wrenching. And, a lot of those kids are lost to us. Some families think, okay, well, their kids are no longer part of our family anymore. And that's just heartbreaking. So we need to do a lot of work in that space. We absolutely need to turn off the tap. But then, for those ones that are, in the system, we need to, significantly increase the amount of resource and effort to get them out. And I think a big part of that is transitioning more control, power, self-determination to Aboriginal people and organisations, so that we can actually, I suppose, do a better job and, reconnect these kids to family, because we're able to identify who those families are a lot quicker, in a more natural way, because we are those families, right? So I think that's probably how I'd answer it. Where funding goes, follow the money, and you'll be able to identify where a whole heap of the problems are, as well as a whole heap of opportunities for improvement.
And if I can just add, we've also got to remember that the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children that enter out-of-home care do so by virtue of neglect, which is absolutely linked to the intergenerational experience of poverty. So while I think there's been some significant efforts at that interface around contact with the system and really active efforts around trying to divert them into other types of arrangements, we've got to remember that the levers, the things that make a difference in terms of addressing poverty, addressing housing inequity, health inequity, those things sit outside of the locus of control of the child protection system. So we actually, require a genuine whole of government approach to address what has been staring us in the face, and that is that inequitable experience of poverty for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So unless we start to address that, we are never going to actually stem the flow of children that enter that system by virtue of neglect.
Yeah, and so this is just like us yarning at work now.
I know, right?
You're absolutely right. And, one of the big struggles and opportunities really is to work with government to think outside of their silos, both within the system, so across the continuum, because you tend to want to break kids and families up into, okay, well, we're going to talk to you about intake today and this tomorrow or whatever. But across government too, you've mentioned housing is a massive one. Thankfully now we have a housing peak in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, but health, education, employment, they're all really critical things. And so, we need to get to a space where we're working with families on at a sort of a local level or regional level where we go, okay, what do we need here? What are the outcomes we're trying to achieve? What do we need? And then what's the total amount of resource we've got to make it work? And then ask people, well, how do you think we ought to use that resource? Because we can't continue to chop people up into little, government silo convenience size bites. We need to look at them, whole of life, much more holistically. So yeah, fantastic point, Nat.
Thanks. It certainly was. I'm very glad you raised the issues of poverty because it is Anti-Poverty Week. There's two major things that the Queensland Anti-Poverty Week Committee has been asking for, as they have been asking for nationally. And that's two major things. And one is that we get the level of income support raised to a level where it is actually above the poverty line. And that means a minimum of $65 a day rather than $45 as currently exists. That would lift people's income above the poverty line. But the other thing is certainly, as you raised, Garth, is housing. And we acknowledge certainly the Queensland government did make a record investment in social housing. However, but beyond that, it's also access to affordable rental accommodation. And there's been no real increase to rental accommodation assistance for 21 years. So the gap that exists between what real rental costs are and the level of assistance that's provided is measured now in hundreds of dollars. So they're the two major asks that we've got. And I think, as Natalie highlighted, that would go a significant way to addressing many of the issues. Thank you very, very much for your contribution. It's incredibly important that the issues that Scott raised, I think, and that Scott has always, we can rely on Scott to make sure that human rights is something that's a lens that we should shine on everything. So as he's very well done, is shine a human rights lens on this issue as well. Did you want to add something, Scott? Yes.
If you could just give me 30 seconds, given it's Anti-Poverty Week, a big issue that remains outstanding in Australia is the unpaid compensation to native title holders going back to 1975. So that's been estimated at anywhere between $80 billion to $500 billion or perhaps even $1 trillion. And which sounds like a crazy amount of money, but when you look at the debt that Australia now has post-COVID, it actually puts it in some perspective. But so I don't think we can talk about poverty and all the problems that flow from it without actually looking at the outstanding debt that is still owing, that was promised many years ago and governments keep ignoring.
Excellent. Well, that's a good, very challenging message to end with. So that's very good. Thank you very much. We've got some more questions coming through, but we'll need to follow up with those later on in order to keep our time schedule. So we'll do that and answer those questions later on. What we'll now do is take a 10-minute break, and we'll be resuming at 11 o'clock with a presentation by Dr. Meredith Kirley, good friend to PeakCare. So we'll see you all again at 11 o'clock, and thank you very, very much to our panel members, Garth, Natalie and Scott. Thank you.